the world was made of dust and jolts. For 3 weeks, that had been Annabeth's truth. Dust settled in the folds of her traveling dress, a sensible gray wool that had seemed so sturdy back in Ohio and now felt as flimsy as a cobweb. It lined her nostrils and coated her tongue. The jolts came from the wagon wheels, which found every rock and rut in the vast, unforgiving trail that stretched across the Montana Territory. Each bump was a reminder that she was moving farther and farther from everything she had ever known, toward a man whose face she had only seen in a faded photograph. Mr. Elias Thorne. His letters had been proper, his words carefully chosen. He wrote of his prosperous ranch, of the need for a good woman to make his house a home, of his desire for a family. He promised stability and respectability. 2 things Annabeth craved with the desperation of a starving woman. At 19, an orphan with no prospects, his proposal was not a dream, but a lifeline. She had packed her mother's lace collar, a Bible, and a heart full of carefully managed hope into a single trunk and traveled west. Now, sitting on the hard wagon bench beside the driver, a sour-faced man named Jeb. She clutched her reticule so tightly her knuckles were white. Inside was the photograph. Elias Thorne was a stern-looking man in his late 30s, with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed to squint against a perpetual sun. He was not handsome, not in the way the boys back home were, but his face looked solid, dependable. That was enough. It had to be. Almost through the pass. Jeb grunted, his voice like gravel. "Be in Harmony Creek by nightfall. Your groom will be waitin'." Annabeth offered a small, nervous smile. "Thank you." She looked out at the landscape. The mountains clawed at the sky, their peaks already dusted with the first snows of late autumn. Pine trees clung to the steep slopes, their scent sharp and clean on the wind. It was a beautiful place, but a hard one. It was a land that did not seem to care for the small hopes of a mail-order bride. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. She was doing the right thing. She had to believe that. This was her chance to build a life, to belong somewhere, to be more than just a girl left behind. The shot came without warning, a crack that echoed through the pass, sharp and final. A bird screeched and took flight. Jeb stiffened beside her, his hand flying to the rifle propped by his seat. Before he could raise it, another shot rang out. Jeb slumped forward without a sound, a dark stain blossoming on the back of his shirt. Annabeth screamed. It was a thin, useless sound swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. Men on horseback swarmed the wagon, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas. They were shouting, their voices coarse and cruel. One of them, a big man with a belly that strained the buttons of his coat, grabbed the reins of the panicked horses, bringing the wagon to a lurching halt. Another man, thin and wiry with eyes like a coyote, leaped onto the wagon bench. He grabbed her arm. Annabeth cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He dragged her from her seat and threw her to the ground. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and she lay gasping in the dirt, the taste of dust now mixed with the metallic tang of fear. Her trunk was thrown from the back of the wagon, its lock bursting on impact. Her few possessions, the Bible, the lace collar, the simple clothes she had so carefully packed, spilled into the dust. The men laughed. One of them picked up the lace collar, holding it between a thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead spider, before letting it drift away on the wind. "Look what we got here," the wiry man said, nudging her with the toe of his boot. Annabeth scrambled backward, away from him, her hands raw from the rocky ground. Her eyes darted around, searching for help, for escape. She saw the other members of their small party. Mr. Henderson, the land surveyor, lay motionless near the front wheel, his spectacles shattered beside him. His wife, a kind woman who had shared her biscuits with Annabeth that morning, was being held by one of the bandits, her face a mask of silent terror. And then she saw him. Elias Thorne. He had ridden out to meet the wagon, to escort his bride the final few miles. He lay in the middle of the road. His good suit was covered in dust, and his chest was a ruin of red. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the cold blue sky. The stern face from the photograph was slack, empty. Her future, her lifeline, was gone. A wave of nausea and a grief so sudden and sharp, it felt like a physical blow washed over her. "Leave her be, Silas," the big man grunted, dismounting. "We got what we came for. Let's go." He was stuffing Mr. Henderson's wallet into his pocket. The man named Silas ignored him. He crouched down in front of Annabeth, his breath hot and foul. "Not yet. She's a pretty little thing. Too pretty to leave for the wolves." He reached for the buttons on her bodice. Annabeth slapped his hand away, a surge of pure, primal fear giving her strength. "No! Do not touch me!" His eyes narrowed, and he raised his hand, striking her across the face. Her head snapped back, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He grabbed a fistful of her hair and began to drag her away from the wagon, toward the dark line of trees. She kicked and struggled, her nails clawing at his arm. But it was useless. He was too strong. "I said leave her," the big man shouted, his voice hard. "She ain't part of the deal. We take the goods, not the women. It brings the marshals down on us." "She's my goods now," Silas snarled, not slowing. "I aim to collect—" "She'll slow us down. She's not worth the trouble," another man called out. The argument raged behind her as she was pulled deeper into the woods. The ground was uneven, catching at the hem of her dress, tearing the fabric. Branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging scratches on her cheeks. Her hope was a dying ember, smothered by a cold, black dread. She was going to die out here, or worse. She closed her eyes, and the face of her mother, pale and peaceful in her coffin, rose in her mind. Perhaps death was not the worst thing. Silas finally stopped behind a thick copse of firs. Shoving her to the ground, he stood over her, breathing heavily, his coyote eyes gleaming with a terrible light. But before he could move, the big man was there, grabbing Silas by the shoulder and spinning him around. "You fool," he hissed. "Do you want a posse on our trail before we even cross the county line? We have enough to worry about." "She saw our faces. She's a half-starved girl from back east. Who's gonna listen to her?" The big man shoved Silas hard. "We leave her, now, or I'll leave you here with her." The threat was real. Silas stared at the bigger man, his face a contorted mask of fury and frustration. He spat on the ground near Annabeth's head. "Fine, let the bears have her." He turned and stalked away. The big man gave her one last, indifferent look before following. Their footsteps faded, leaving only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. Annabeth lay on the cold ground, curled into a tight ball, every muscle in her body trembling. She didn't move. She couldn't. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. She was alone, utterly, completely alone in the vast, silent wilderness. The cold began to seep into her bones, a deep, numbing chill that seemed to come from the earth itself. She closed her eyes, and the world went away. Days bled into one another in a haze of pain and cold. Time had no meaning. There was only the gnawing ache in her belly, the thirst that cracked her lips, and the cold that was her constant companion. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a merciful blank. Sometimes she dreamed of the attack, the images disjointed and nightmarish, a flash of steel, the smell of gunpowder, the vacant stare of Elias Thorne. Other times she dreamed of her childhood home in Ohio, of the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the smell of baking bread. She would wake with a gasp, the loss a fresh wound, only to find herself still in the unforgiving wilderness. She had crawled into a shallow ravine, seeking shelter from the wind. The torn remnants of her dress offered little protection against the elements. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground and the pine needles with a delicate layer of white. It was beautiful, in a cruel sort of way. A beautiful shroud for a girl who had come west to find a home and had found only a grave. She was so tired. It would be easy to just close her eyes, to let the snow cover her, to sleep, just sleep. That was the thought in her mind when she heard the sound, the soft thud of hooves on the damp earth. At first, she thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or a wolf. She held her breath, too weak to even feel fear anymore. The sound grew closer, then stopped. A shadow fell over her. She forced her heavy eyelids to open a crack. A man stood there, silhouetted against the gray sky. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a figure of substance in a world that had become thin and unreal. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a worn hat pulled low over his eyes. His horse, a sturdy-looking roan, stood patiently behind him. Luke was bone-weary. The cattle run had been long and brutal, and the thought of his small, quiet cabin was the only thing that had kept him going for the past week. He wanted nothing more than a hot meal, a stiff drink, and the blessed solitude he had built his life around. He had cut through the high pass as a shortcut, a risk with the weather turning, but one he was willing to take. He saw the splash of gray against the dark earth of the ravine from a distance. He thought it was a dead deer at first, but as he drew closer, he saw the shape of it, the impossible shape of a woman. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft ground. He approached slowly, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip, a habit born of years spent in a land that was rarely kind. She was lying on her side, half covered in snow, her hair a tangled, dirty mess of pale blonde. Her dress was torn, her face bruised and scratched, but she was alive. He could see the faint, fluttering rise and fall of her chest. He knelt beside her. Her skin was as cold as marble, her lips tinged with blue. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were the color of a summer sky, dazed and clouded with pain. They looked at him without recognition, without comprehension. His first instinct was to ride on. This was not his trouble. Getting involved with people, especially a woman in this kind of state, was a complication he neither wanted nor needed. His life was simple. He worked, he ate, he slept. That was all. He could ride to Harmony Creek, tell the sheriff, and be done with it. That was the sensible thing to do. But he looked down at her, at the fragile pulse he could just barely see beating in the hollow of her throat. And he knew he could not leave her. He could not leave her for the cold and the wolves. Whatever his past, whatever sins he carried, he was not that man. With a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he made a decision. It was an impulsive, foolish decision, the kind he had spent the last 10 years avoiding. He gently slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a bird. She gave a small, weak moan as he lifted her, her head lolling against his shoulder. The journey back to his cabin was a slow, punishing ordeal. He could not ride with her in his arms, so he walked, leading the roan with one hand, cradling the unconscious woman against his chest with the other. The snow fell harder now, thick, wet flakes that clung to his hat and coat and melted on her pale cheeks. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, a mournful, lonely sound. His cabin was nestled deep in a small, wooded valley, miles from any road, miles from any other living soul. It was his sanctuary, his fortress against the world, and now he was bringing the world into it. He finally reached the cabin as dusk was turning to a deep, starless night. His shoulders ached, his legs burned, but he did not stop. He kicked open the door and carried her inside, into the cold, dark interior. He laid her gently on his own narrow bed, the only bed in the one-room cabin. He lit the lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, revealing the simple, sparse furnishings. A table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with a few books and tins of food. He built a fire, his movements quick and efficient. Soon, flames were crackling in the hearth, chasing the chill from the room. He filled a basin with water from the bucket by the door and found a clean cloth. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to gently wash the grime and dried blood from her face. Her skin was soft beneath the dirt. He worked in silence, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were calloused and scarred. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. He only knew that she was here, in his home, and that, for now, she was his responsibility. Annabeth woke to the smell of wood smoke and the soft warmth of a wool blanket. For a moment, she was disoriented, floating in a place between dream and reality. The last thing she remembered was the cold, the endless, soul-deep cold. But now she was warm. She was alive. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was made of rough-hewn logs. A fire danced in a stone fireplace across the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She was in a bed, tucked beneath a heavy blanket. She pushed herself up on her elbows, a sharp pain lancing through her ribs. She looked down at herself. She was still in the tattered remains of her dress, but someone had covered her modestly. A man sat at a small table near the fire, his back to her. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements methodical and sure. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She made a small sound, a choked gasp. The man stopped what he was doing and turned his head. In the firelight, she could see his face more clearly now. It was a lean, weathered face, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His hair was dark, his jaw shadowed with a few days' growth of beard. His eyes, when they met hers, were a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky. They held no malice, only a quiet, watchful stillness. "You are awake," he said. His voice was low and rough, like his hands. Annabeth tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and only a croak came out. She swallowed, trying again. Where am I?" "My cabin," he said simply. He stood up and walked to the hearth, ladling some broth from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her. "You need to eat." She flinched as he approached, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. He stopped, a few feet from the bed, and set the bowl down on a small crate. He did not try to come closer. "I will not hurt you," he said, his voice even. "You are safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign, a language she no longer understood. She looked at him, searching his face for a lie, for the cruelty she had come to expect from men, but she saw none. He simply looked tired. He backed away, returning to his chair by the fire. She reached for the bowl, her hands trembling. The broth was warm and savory, and as she sipped it, she felt a flicker of strength return to her limbs. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving the man. He did not watch her. He had gone back to cleaning his rifle, his attention focused on his task. The memories came back then, in sharp, brutal flashes. The ambush, the face of Elias Thorne, blank and still. The wiry man's foul breath on her face. She put the bowl down, her appetite gone, replaced by a cold, sickening shame. What had they done to her? She could not remember everything. There were gaps, black spaces in her memory, and she was terrified of what might fill them. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke that night. The wind shrieked around the small cabin, and snow beat against the single window pane. It was a wild, violent sound, but inside, by the fire, it was strangely peaceful. They were sealed off from the world, an island in a sea of white. The days that followed fell into a quiet routine. The storm raged for weeks, piling snow in deep drifts against the door and walls. They were trapped. Luke, he had told her his name was Luke, would spend hours each day hauling firewood, his face raw from the wind when he returned. Annabeth, as her strength slowly returned, did what she could to help. She swept the floor, mended the tear in his coat, and made their meager rations of salt pork and beans stretch as far as possible. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was vast, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, born of solitude and survival. Luke never asked her what had happened, where she had come from, or who she was. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the snow and the wind, as a simple fact of his life now. He treated her with a distant kindness that she found more comforting than any words of pity. He would leave a cup of water for her when he saw her stirring from a nightmare. He kept the fire blazing, a bulwark against the cold and the darkness. But the darkness was inside her, too. She avoided the small, cracked piece of mirror that hung by the door. The face she saw there was a stranger's, thin and pale, with dark circles under the eyes and a haunted look she did not recognize. She would flinch if Luke's hand brushed hers as he passed her a plate. The touch of a man, any man, was a source of terror. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of torment. She would dream of the bandits, of their leering faces and rough hands. She would wake up with a silent scream caught in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat. One night, the dream was worse than usual. She was back in the ravine, the cold seeping into her bones, the snow falling on her face like icy tears. She was dying, and she was alone. A cry escaped her lips, a raw sound of pure desolation. She woke to a hand on her shoulder. She cried out, scrambling away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Easy now," a low voice said. It was Luke. He was kneeling by the bed, his face etched with concern in the dim firelight. "You were dreaming." Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. The despair from the dream clung to her, a suffocating weight. She could not stop shaking. She was so alone, so terribly, terribly alone. Luke hesitated for a moment. Then he sat on the edge of the bed. He did not say anything. He simply reached out and pulled her against his chest, holding her as one might hold a frightened child. His coat was rough against her cheek, and he smelled of pine smoke in the cold night air. He was solid, warm, and real. She stiffened at first, her body rigid with fear, but he did not move. His hold was firm but not restraining. It was protective. Slowly, tentatively, the terror began to recede, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and a desperate, aching need for comfort. She sagged against him, her hands coming up to clutch at the front of his coat. A sob broke from her. Then another. She wept into his chest, letting go of all the fear and grief and shame she had held inside for weeks. He held her through it all, his hand stroking her tangled hair in a slow, calming rhythm. He did not speak, letting her tears run their course. After a long time, her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. She was exhausted, but the crushing weight on her chest had eased, just a little. She felt his strength, a quiet, steady presence in the dark. She did not want to move. She did not want him to move. In his arms, for the first time since the world had fallen apart, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever. Safety. She was drifting back to sleep, her face still pressed against his shoulder, her hands still clutching his coat. As consciousness faded, she whispered the words, her voice thick with sleep and sorrow. "Please don't let go yet." He did not answer, but his arm tightened around her, holding her fast. He did not let go. He held her all through the long, dark night, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. The morning after she had whispered those words into his coat, the air in the cabin had changed. The storm still raged outside, a relentless assault of wind and snow. But inside, a fragile truce had been declared. The silence that settled between them was no longer just the absence of words, but a space filled with a new, unspoken understanding. Luke no longer seemed like a stranger who had rescued her, but something else, something she did not have a name for, a guardian. As the days turned into another week, and then another, Annabeth's physical strength began to return. The deep ache in her bones subsided, and the bruises on her face faded from a shocking purple to a pale, sickly yellow, and then disappeared altogether. With the return of her health came a desperate need to reclaim some part of herself, to scrub away the stain of helplessness. She could not erase what had happened, but she could refuse to be defined by it. She would not be a victim huddled under a blanket. She would be useful. She started small. One morning, while Luke was outside battling the snow to clear a path to the woodpile, she found his mending kit in a small wooden box. It contained a few spools of dark thread, a rusted thimble, and a handful of bent needles. It was a bachelor's kit, meant for crude repairs. But for Annabeth, whose mother had taught her to sew a seam as straight and true as a moral principle, it was enough. She took his heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had wrapped her in, the one that still held the faint scent of him, and set to work. The sleeve had a long tear from a snagged branch. Her fingers, still stiff from the cold, moved slowly at first, but the rhythm of the needle moving in and out of the thick fabric was a comfort. It was a familiar, purposeful action in a world that had become terrifyingly random. By the time Luke returned, his eyebrows and mustache white with snow, the tear was gone, replaced by a line of neat, nearly invisible stitches. He noticed it immediately. He stopped in the doorway, shrugging off the coat, and ran his thumb over the mended seam. He looked from the coat to her, where she sat by the fire, pretending to be absorbed in warming her hands. He said nothing, but a look passed over his face, a flicker of something she could not decipher. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. He simply hung the coat on its peg and went about the business of stoking the fire. From that day on, he left his mended coat by the door. Emboldened, she turned her attention to the food. Their diet was monotonous: salt pork, beans, and the hardtack biscuits Luke kept in a tin. But in the back of a cupboard, she found a small sack of cornmeal and another of precious flour. It felt like discovering gold. That afternoon, the cabin was filled with a new smell, a warm, rich aroma that fought back against the ever-present scent of wood smoke and damp wool. She made cornbread, baking it in a heavy skillet set over the coals. The first loaf was a little burnt on the bottom, a little doughy in the middle, but it was bread. It was nourishment. It was a small piece of civilization in the heart of the wilderness. When she served it to him with their evening meal of beans, he ate his piece slowly, deliberately, as if committing the taste to memory. When he was finished, he looked at her across the small table, the firelight casting a warm glow on his weathered face. "It is good," he said. And for Luke, a man who seemed to use words as if each one cost him something, it was high praise. Her usefulness became her armor. She scrubbed the floor with a stiff brush until the wood planks were pale and clean. She organized the shelves, stacking the tins in neat rows. She washed their few clothes in melted snow water, hanging them on a line strung across the cabin to dry in the heat of the fire. Each task was an act of defiance. The bandits had tried to reduce her to nothing, an object to be used and discarded. But here, in this small, isolated cabin, she was becoming a person again. She was Annabeth, the girl who could mend a coat and bake a loaf of bread and make a home out of nothing. One afternoon, the wind died down enough for Luke to work outside for more than an hour at a time. He was repairing a section of the small corral fence that had been damaged by a falling branch. Annabeth watched him from the window as she kneaded dough for a second loaf of bread. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, his broad shoulders straining against the fabric of his shirt as he dug a new post hole in the frozen ground. The cold did not seem to touch him. He was a part of this harsh landscape, as rugged and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. On impulse, she cut a thick slice from the fresh, warm loaf of cornbread, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and pulled on the spare coat he had given her, an old, oversized wool jacket that smelled of him. The cold hit her with a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow was deep, coming up to her knees, and the short walk to the corral was a struggle. He did not hear her approach over the sound of his work. She stood there for a moment, watching him set the new post, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Luke," she said, her voice small in the vast silence. He turned, startled. He straightened up, wiping a hand across his forehead, though it was too cold to sweat. "You should be inside." "I know," she said, holding out the bundle. "I thought you might be hungry." He looked at the cloth-wrapped offering in her hands, then back at her face. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and a few strands of blonde hair had escaped her bun to whip around her face in the breeze. For a long moment, he just looked at her. It was a different kind of look than she had ever received from a man. It was not appraising, nor was it possessive. It was quiet, attentive, as if he were seeing her for the very first time. He took the cornbread from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, small but sharp, went through her. It was not a jolt of fear, but of something else. Something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it. A spark. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of the same surprise she felt. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, until it felt as if the whole world had gone silent around them. He was the one to break the spell. He cleared his throat and looked down at the bread in his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He took a bite, not moving from his spot. She just nodded, suddenly shy, and turned to make her way back through the snow to the warmth of the cabin, her heart beating a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. That evening, the silence felt different again. It was charged, alive with the memory of that shared look. They sat by the fire, Annabeth with her mending, Luke sharpening a knife, the scrape of steel on the stone the only sound, but she could feel his eyes on her when he thought she was not looking. Her mind was a whirl of confusion. She had come west to be a bride, to belong to a man she had never met. That future was gone, buried in a shallow grave in a mountain pass. What was she now? A survivor, a burden, a ghost haunting this silent man's cabin. The shame of what had happened, of the gaps in her memory, was a constant, cold weight in her stomach. She was damaged goods, ruined. No respectable man would ever want her now. The thought made her hands tremble, and she pricked her finger with the needle. A small drop of blood welled up, a bright spot of red against her pale skin. She put her finger in her mouth, the metallic taste sharp on her tongue. Without thinking, she spoke the question that had been tormenting her, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think anyone will ever see me as a bride again?" The scraping of the knife stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. She did not dare to look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on her sewing, her face burning with humiliation. It was a foolish, desperate question to ask of this man, this stranger. He did not answer for a long time. She thought he was going to ignore her, to pretend he had not heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "I do not know about anyone else," he said. He paused, and she could feel him choosing his words with care. "But when I look at you, you already look like one." Her head snapped up. She stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. He was looking directly at her, his expression serious, his gray eyes clear and direct. There was no pity in his gaze, no artifice. He had said it as if it were a simple statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue or the snow was cold. To him, in that moment, it was the truth. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, but they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of something else, a profound, aching gratitude that ached in her chest. He had given her a gift she had thought she would never receive again, a glimpse of herself through eyes that did not see her as ruined. He saw the tears and looked away, uncomfortable, as if he had said too much. He went back to sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scraping filling the silence once more. But the words hung in the air between them, shimmering and powerful. "You already look like one." Luke worked the whetstone over the blade, his motions automatic. His mind was not on the knife. It was on the girl with the summer sky eyes and the tears on her cheeks. He had not meant to say it. The words had just come out. But they were true. When he looked at her, with her quiet dignity and her fierce determination to create a small pocket of order in the chaos of their lives, he did not see a victim. He saw a strength that humbled him. He saw her, and it reminded him of another woman, another life. Sarah. Her name was a ghost on his lips. He had been young then, before the war, full of plans and foolish certainty. They were to be married in the spring. He had carried the ring, a simple gold band, in his pocket for a month, waiting for the right moment. He remembered the smell of lilacs in her father's garden, the feel of her hand in his. He remembered the future he had seen so clearly, a home, children, a life spent on the land his father and grandfather had worked. Then the war had come, a dark cloud on the horizon that had swept in and consumed everything. He had gone to fight, filled with a righteous fire that had long since burned out, leaving only ashes. When he came back, 4 years later, he was a different man. He was harder, quieter, with a piece of shrapnel still buried deep in his side that ached with every change in the weather, and a collection of memories in his head that woke him in a cold sweat some nights. And the farm was gone, a smoldering ruin. His parents, his younger brother, all gone. Not in the war, but in the bitter, lawless aftermath, victims of raiders who had swept through while the good men were away killing each other. Sarah had waited for him, but the man who returned was not the boy she had promised to marry. He was a ghost, haunted by things he could not speak of. He looked at her hopeful, loving face, and all he could see was the life he could no longer give her, the man he could no longer be. He had broken the engagement, telling her she deserved better than a broken man with nothing to his name but a bad leg and a head full of nightmares. He had walked away and never looked back, heading west until he ran out of places to run, finally settling in this isolated cabin where the only ghosts were his own. He looked at Annabeth, a woman whose life had also been burned to the ground. He had thought his solitude was a fortress, but her quiet presence had breached his walls without him even realizing it. A few days later, Annabeth made a discovery that would change everything again. Luke had a small stack of old newspapers he used for kindling, brought back from his rare trips to town. While looking for a piece to line a shelf, her eyes fell on a headline from the Harmony Creek Herald, dated just a few weeks prior. "Bandits strike in Mountain Pass. Wagon train ambushed." Her blood ran cold. With trembling hands, she spread the brittle paper out on the table. She read the story, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm. It was all there. The attack, the death of the driver, Jeb, the murder of the land surveyor, Mr. Henderson, and the groom who had been riding to meet his bride, Mr. Elias Thorne. The article was brief, clinical. It listed the names of the dead. And then she saw her own name. Annabeth Miller, the intended bride of Mr. Thorne, is also listed as missing, presumed dead. Missing, presumed dead. The words seemed to leap off the page. The world saw her as a ghost. She was gone, erased. All the shame, all the worry about what people would say, about how they would look at her. It was all meaningless. You could not pass judgment on a dead woman. A strange, hysterical sound escaped her lips. It was half a sob, half a laugh. She sank into a chair, the newspaper clutched in her hands. She wept. She wept for the girl who had traveled west with such carefully managed hope. She wept for the life that had been stolen from her. And she wept with a wild, terrifying sense of release. She was erased, but she was also free. Free from a future she had never chosen. Free from the scandal that would have followed her. Free from everything but this small cabin and the silent man who had saved her. Luke found her there. her head bowed on the table, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The newspaper spread out before her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Taking in the scene, he saw the headline, and he understood. He walked over to the table and stood beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the room. He did not touch her, did not offer any empty words of comfort. He just stood there, a silent witness to her grief and her strange, painful rebirth. When her weeping finally subsided, she looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and raw. "They think I am dead," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "It is over," she said, more to herself than to him. "It is all over." He looked down at her, at the tangle of her blonde hair, at the fierce, fragile strength in her tear-streaked face. He thought of the moment he had found her, a splash of gray in the snow, a life on the verge of being extinguished. He thought of his own empty life before that day, and he spoke a truth he had not admitted even to himself. "When I found you," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "I was glad. Glad to find you, even if I did not know why." That night, another storm rolled in, this one different from the relentless snow. It was a thunderstorm, a rare and violent thing for this time of year. The sky, which had been a placid gray for weeks, turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain, not snow, began to lash against the cabin. Then the lightning came, splitting the sky with jagged, brilliant flashes, followed seconds later by cracks of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Annabeth had never been afraid of storms, but this one was different. The violence of it mirrored the violence in her memories. Each crash of thunder was like a gunshot, each flash of lightning like the glint of a knife. She was in her small cot on the other side of the hearth, trying to sleep, but it was impossible. With one particularly deafening crack of thunder, a primal, childlike fear overtook her. Before she even knew what she was doing, she was out of her bed and across the room, running to the only source of safety she knew. "Luke!" He was sitting up in his bed, already awake. The next flash of lightning illuminated the room, and he saw her standing there, trembling, her thin cotton shift clinging to her damp skin from the humidity in the air. Her eyes were wide with terror. He did not say a word. He simply threw back his blanket. It was an invitation. She hesitated for only a second before scrambling into the narrow bed beside him. She was shaking uncontrollably. His jaw tightened as he looked at her vulnerability, at the fear that was so raw and real. He reached for his heavy sheepskin coat, which was draped over a chair, and pulled it over her, covering her from the storm and from his own gaze. He lay back down, his body rigid, careful not to touch her, but she instinctively curled toward his warmth, her small body still trembling. After a moment, he let out a slow breath and tentatively put his arm around her, pulling her against his side. His touch was gentle, protective. It was not the touch of a lover, but of a guardian. He held her like that, her head tucked under his chin, his arm a solid barrier against the storm that raged both outside and within her. He felt the wild, panicked beating of her heart gradually slow, her shudders subsiding until she was just a warm, soft weight against him. He held her gently, his own desires a distant, tightly controlled ache. He would not cross that line. He would not be another man who took something from her. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor, streamed through the window, casting a bright stripe of light across the wooden floor. The world outside was washed clean, glistening and new. Annabeth woke first. She was still nestled against Luke, his arm still around her, his breathing slow and even in sleep. For a moment, she did not move, soaking in the unfamiliar feeling of waking up in the arms of another person, of feeling completely, utterly safe. She looked at his face in the morning light. The hard lines around his eyes and mouth were softened in sleep. He looked younger, more vulnerable. This man, this silent, solitary man, had saved her life. But he had done more than that. He had given her a space to heal. He had protected her, not just from the elements, but from the darkness in her own mind. She slipped out of the bed, careful not to wake him, and pulled on her dress. She went to the fireplace and began to build up the fire, her movements quiet and deliberate. As the flames began to catch, he stirred and opened his eyes. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. She turned from the fire and looked at him, her heart full of a gratitude so immense it felt like it might break her. She thought of the fear she had lived with for so long, a constant companion, and she realized that sometime in the night it had gone. She spoke softly into the quiet of the new morning, her voice clear and steady. "You are the only man," she said, "who has ever made me feel safe again." Her declaration, spoken into the quiet of the morning, hung in the air like the last note of a song. It had not been an accusation or a plea, but a simple statement of fact, and in its simplicity, it had forged a new kind of bond between them. The boundary of rescuer and rescued, of guardian and ward, had dissolved, leaving them as something else entirely, a man and a woman, alone together against the vast, white world. The snow continued to fall, a silent, persistent siege that locked them in their small fortress of a cabin. But what had once been a shared confinement became a shared existence. Their daily routines, born of necessity, now took on the rhythm of a quiet domesticity. The intimacy was not in words, but in actions, a language they were both fluent in. It was in the way he now waited for her to wake before he stoked the morning fire, or the way she knew just how he liked his coffee. Strong and black. Their world was small, contained within the 4 log walls, but it was a world they built together each day. Chopping wood was no longer his solitary task. She would follow him out into the biting cold, her face wrapped in a wool scarf, and she would gather the smaller pieces of kindling while he swung the axe, the clean, sharp reports echoing in the still air. When they came back inside, their cheeks red and their fingers numb, she would brush the snow from the shoulders of his coat, and he, in turn, would gently dust the flakes from her hair. These were small, unconscious gestures, but they were as intimate as a touch, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared life. He would hold the heavy bucket of water still for her as she ladled from it. She would place a plate of hot food before him, and their eyes would meet over the steam, a silent conversation passing between them. The silence that had once been a buffer became a vessel, and Annabeth found herself growing bold enough to fill it. She wanted to know the man who had saved her, to understand the currents that ran beneath his calm, quiet surface. She began to ask questions, not prying, but pushing gently at the edges of his solitude. "Were you born here?" she asked one evening, as she darned one of his socks by the firelight. He looked up from the harness he was mending, his hands stilling. "No, I was born in Pennsylvania, on a farm." "Was it a big farm?" He nodded, his eyes distant, looking at something far beyond the cabin walls. "Big enough. My father and his father before him worked it. I thought I would, too." "What happened?" she asked softly. A shadow passed over his face. He set the harness down. "The war happened." He did not elaborate, and she did not press, but a few nights later, the subject came up again. He had been staring into the fire, his jaw tight, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. "My brother, Daniel, he was younger than me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He always wanted to see the mountains. He used to read books about them. Said the air was so clean it would scrub a man's soul, right? He was going to come west with me, after the war." "He sounds like he was a good man," Annabeth offered. "He was the best of us," Luke said, and the finality in his tone was a closed door. But she knew, without him saying the words, that Daniel had not come back from the war. She saw the guilt he carried in the set of his shoulders, the profound, abiding sorrow of the survivor. She was beginning to see the man, not just the rescuer. She saw the loneliness he had wrapped around himself like a coat, and her heart ached for him. Her own story felt small and foolish in comparison, but his quiet confessions gave her the courage to offer her own. One night, as the wind rattled the window pane, she found herself telling him about her life in Ohio, about being an orphan passed from one reluctant relative to another. "I was never anything but a burden," she explained, her eyes on the mending in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. "Another mouth to feed, another bed to be made. When I was old enough, I worked as a hired girl, but there was never a place that felt like home. There was never a place I belonged." She took a breath, the next words tasting like ash in her mouth. Mr. Thorne's proposal. It was not about love. It was about a place, a home of my own. "I thought if I could be a good wife, a useful wife, then maybe I could finally earn a place to belong." She looked up at him then, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It was a desperation. You see, I was so desperate to not be alone anymore." She faltered, the memory of the ambush rising like bile in her throat. The shame. It was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that had been there for weeks. "Those men, they looked at me like I was nothing, less than an animal. Just a thing for their use." Her voice broke. "I keep trying to remember what happened, but there are parts that are missing, and I am afraid of what those parts are. I feel so unclean, soiled." She finally said the word that had haunted her sleep, the brand she had seared upon her own soul. "Ruined." Luke, who had been listening with a fierce, unwavering attention, reached across the small space that separated them. He did not touch her. He simply rested his hand on the table, his knuckles white. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with an emotion she could not name. It was not pity. It was something harder, stronger. It was anger. "You listen to me," he said, his gray eyes boring into hers. "You were not ruined. You were abandoned. There is a difference." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Abandoned, not ruined. The men who had attacked her, they had abandoned her to die. Her would-be husband was dead. The world, which presumed her dead, had abandoned her. The word did not erase the horror, but it shifted the weight of it. Ruin was a state of being, a final judgment on her worth. Abandonment was something that had been done to her. It was an action, not an identity. A great, shuddering breath escaped her, a sound that was almost a sob. She looked at him, and for the first time, she felt that the cold knot of shame inside her might, one day, begin to dissolve. After that night, the air in the cabin shifted again. It became charged, thick with unspoken things. The long silences were no longer just comfortable. They were electric. A simple glance held a universe of meaning. When he passed her a log for the fire, their fingers would brush, and a current would pass between them, sharp and undeniable. She became acutely aware of him, of the space he occupied, of the sound of his breathing in the quiet of the night. The cabin, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt impossibly small, every inch of it humming with a new, dangerous energy. Annabeth felt a restlessness she could not name. The gray wool dress she had worn for weeks felt like a costume, the uniform of a person she no longer was. One afternoon, while searching for a spare cloth in Luke's supply chest, she found it, a bolt of simple calico fabric, printed with small, cheerful blue flowers. It was the sort of fabric a homesteader's wife might use for curtains, or an apron, or a simple house dress. He had likely bought it for some practical purpose and forgotten it. To Annabeth, it was a treasure. She took it out, the crisp newness of the fabric a stark contrast to her own worn, tattered garment. An idea took root in her mind, a fierce, determined need. She would make herself a new dress. It was more than just a whim. It was an act of reclamation. She was not the mail-order bride in sensible gray. She was not the victim in a torn and dirt-stained shroud. She would be someone new. She set to work with a feverish intensity, using the seams of her old dress as a rough guide. She cut and stitched by the light of the fire, her needle flying. The work consumed her, focusing her thoughts, channeling the restless energy that coursed through her veins. Luke watched her. He would sit in his chair, pretending to read or mend his tack, but she would feel his eyes on her. She would glance up and catch him looking, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. She saw longing in his eyes, a deep, aching hunger that mirrored her own. But she also saw something else, a sadness, a restraint, as if he were watching a beautiful, wild bird that he knew he could never cage, a bird that would one day fly away. The sight of her, creating something new and beautiful, seemed to pain him as much as it captivated him. One evening, a fresh storm blew in, piling snow against the door and howling down the chimney. The draft reversed, and the cabin began to fill with thick, acrid smoke. They coughed and choked, their eyes streaming. As Luke fought to clear the blockage, he finally succeeded, but not before they had both been soaked by the wet. Heavy snow that had fallen down the chimney flew, extinguishing the fire and drenching everything nearby. They were both shivering, their clothes soaked through with icy, soot-stained water. The fire was out. The cabin plunged into a damp, bone-chilling cold. "We have to get these clothes off," Luke said, his voice grim. "We will freeze in them." He was right. Annabeth's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. With numb fingers, Luke managed to coax a new fire to life. The small flames licked at the kindling, a fragile promise of warmth in the cold, smoky room. They stood before it, two shivering figures in the flickering light. Annabeth's hands went to the buttons of her old gray dress, but her fingers were too cold and clumsy to work them. Luke saw her struggle. He stepped forward, his face set in grim lines. "Here," he said, and gently pushed her hands away. His fingers, large and calloused, moved with a surprising deftness, unfastening the buttons one by one. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was careful not to let his hands touch her skin, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. He helped her slip the wet, heavy dress off her shoulders, leaving her standing in her thin, damp chemise. The firelight flickered over her, casting a golden glow on her pale skin, her slender shoulders, her bare arms. She felt utterly exposed, vulnerable in a way she had not felt since the attack. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest. Luke saw the motion. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, and he did what his honor demanded. He turned away from her, presenting her with his broad, solid back. He began to unbutton his own wet shirt, his movements stiff. The sight of his back, of him turning away, sent a sharp, unexpected pang through her. For weeks, he had been her protector. His gaze had been her refuge. He had looked at her and seen a bride, not a ruined woman. For him to turn away now felt like a rejection, as if, when finally faced with her, he found her wanting, or worse, as if he was turning away from the desire she saw so clearly in his eyes, a desire she was just beginning to admit she shared. And in that moment, she knew she could not bear it, not from him. "Do not," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Do not turn away from me. Not you." He froze, his hands still on his shirt. Slowly, he turned back to face her. His eyes were dark, turbulent pools of emotion. He saw the look on her face, not of fear, but of a fierce, trembling resolve. She took a step forward, closing the small space between them. She reached up, her cold fingers touching his warm, rough cheek. "Not you," she repeated, her voice full of all the unspoken longing of the past months. His control, stretched taut for so long, finally snapped. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and his hands came up to cup her face. His head descended, and his lips met hers, It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was slow and aching, full of a pain and a hunger that stole her breath. It was the taste of wood smoke and winter, of solitude and survival. It was months of charged glances, of unspoken words, of a shared silence finally finding a voice. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling herself closer, molding her body to his. He was so strong, so warm. She felt his arms go around her, one hand sliding down her back to press her against him, the other burying itself in her hair. The kiss deepened, becoming a tender exploration, a question and an answer all at once. It was a raw, emotionally intense moment, a collision of two lonely souls who had found an anchor in one another. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing heavily. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, his eyes searching hers in the firelight. The intensity of it, the sheer force of the emotion unleashed between them, was overwhelming. It was too much, too soon. A small, choked sob escaped her. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of this feeling, this powerful, terrifying feeling that was blooming in the desolate landscape of her heart. He saw the tears gather in her eyes and instantly drew back, his expression stricken with guilt. "Annabeth, I am sorry." "No," she whispered, shaking her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It is not you. It is just—" She could not finish. He understood. He gently led her to his bed, the only dry place in the cabin. He sat her down and pulled the heavy wool blanket from it, wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. He sat beside her, not touching her, but his presence was a comfort. The fire crackled and hissed, slowly warming the room. She cried quietly, her face buried in the blanket. It was a release of all the pent-up tension, all the fear, all the longing. After a long moment, she felt him shift beside her. He lay down on the bed and gently pulled her down next to him, pulling the blanket over both of them. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. It was the same protective embrace he had given her before, but this time, everything was different. He held her until her quiet sobs subsided, his hand stroking her hair. The hunger was still there, a low, burning fire in his veins, but he banked it, pushing it down. He had seen the look in her eyes. He knew he had to be patient. He had to be what she needed him to be, a protector, a safe harbor. He whispered into her hair, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I will wait. Just tell me when." His promise, whispered into the darkness, was a seed planted in frozen ground. "I will wait. Just tell me when." And in the days that followed, as they navigated the new, fragile landscape of their shared desire, that promise was the sun and the rain that allowed a tentative new life to begin. They existed in a state of exquisite tension, a world of lingering touches and gazes that held entire conversations. He did not press her, and she, in turn, began the slow, painstaking work of learning to trust not just him, but herself. Then, one morning, Annabeth woke to a new sound, not the howl of the wind or the hiss of snow against the window, but a gentle, persistent dripping. She slipped out of bed and went to the window, scraping a small patch of frost from the pane. The world outside was transformed. The relentless white was in retreat, surrendering in patches to the dark, damp earth beneath. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin and from the heavy branches of the pine trees. The air itself seemed lighter, thinner, carrying on it the clean, sharp scent of melting snow and wet soil. Spring was coming. Later that day, the sun, a pale, watery disk, broke through the clouds for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Its weak warmth was the most glorious thing Annabeth had ever felt. While Luke was out checking his snares, she was overcome by a wild, impulsive need. She pushed open the cabin door, the swollen wood groaning in protest, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but it was a living cold, full of the promise of warmth to come, on a whim. She bent down and unlaced her worn boots, pulling them off along with her thick wool stockings. She took a breath, and then she stepped onto a patch of ground where the snow had melted, her bare feet sinking into the cold, soft mud. The shock of it made her gasp, a mix of cold and a pleasure so intense it was almost painful. It was the feeling of life, of the solid, real earth beneath her. For months, she had walked on snow, on ice, on the wooden floor of the cabin. She had been unmoored, but this was grounding. She curled her toes in the mud, a slow smile spreading across her face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She tilted her head back, closed her eyes, and breathed in the fresh, clean air of the thaw. She was alive. She had survived. When Luke returned, he found her there, a slender figure in her new blue calico dress, her bare feet muddy, her face turned up to the sky. He stopped, his catch of 2 rabbits dangling from his hand, and simply watched her for a moment. He saw not the frightened girl he had carried from the ravine, but a woman, strong and resilient, who was finding her own footing on the earth again. The sight of her, so full of simple, quiet joy, made his heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness that was almost unbearable. The melting of the snow brought with it the melting of their isolation. The world was returning, and with it, its rules and its judgments. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Luke spoke the words Annabeth had been dreading. "The pass will be clear in another week or 2, he said, his eyes on the flames. "I can take you to Harmony Creek. You can get a room at the boarding house. Find some work. You will be safe there." The warmth of the fire seemed to recede, a chill creeping over Annabeth's skin. The cabin, which had been her entire world, suddenly felt like a temporary shelter whose walls were about to be dismantled. She looked around at the small, familiar space, the neatly stacked shelves, the mended coat on its peg, the worn wooden table where they shared their silent meals. This was the only home she had ever really known, the only place she had ever felt she truly belonged. "And what would I tell them?" she asked, her voice a small, tight thing. "Who would I say that I am?" "You would tell them the truth," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "About the ambush, about what happened." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "The truth? And what part of the truth would that be? Luke? The part where my intended husband was killed and I was dragged off by bandits? The part where I lived for months, alone, with a man who is not my kin and not my husband? What do you think they will see when they look at me?" Her voice cracked. "Here, with you, I know who I am. Out there, what am I? Luke, a dead woman, a runaway, a scandal." She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What if they say I do not belong to anyone?" Her question, so full of a deep, primal fear, struck him silent. He had no answer for her, because he knew she was right. The world was not a kind place for a woman in her position. He had offered her a practical solution, the only one a sensible man could offer. But her fear was not a practical matter. It was a matter of the heart, and in his own heart, the thought of her leaving, of this cabin returning to its empty silence, was a cold, hard knot of dread. They did not speak of it again, but the idea of the outside world was now a constant presence, a third person in the room with them. A few days later, that presence took on a real and terrifying form. Annabeth was kneading bread dough when she heard it, the sound of a horse. Not Luke's sturdy roan, but another, approaching the cabin at a steady clip. A knot of pure ice formed in her stomach. No one ever came here. She ran to the window. A man on a tall bay gelding was riding out of the trees, a silver star pinned to his heavy coat. A marshal. "Luke," she hissed. He was at the door in an instant, his face grim. He saw the rider and his eyes met hers. There was no time to think, no time to plan. There was only instinct. "The root cellar," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now. Do not make a sound." He pushed her toward the trapdoor in the floor, hidden beneath a bearskin rug. She scrambled down the short ladder into the small, dark space, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cellar smelled of damp earth, potatoes, and fear. Luke swung the heavy door shut, and the world went dark. She could hear the muffled sound of his boots as he dragged the rug back into place. She crouched in the darkness, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to control her ragged breathing. She could hear the man dismount, his spurs jingling. Then, the sound of his heavy knock on the cabin door. "Hello, the cabin!" a gruff voice called out. She heard Luke open the door. "Marshall," he said, his voice calm, betraying none of the tension she knew he must be feeling. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Kane. Just making my rounds," the marshal said. His voice was closer now. He must have stepped inside. "Heard a rumor down in Harmony Creek. Said a lone trapper up this way might have taken in a woman, a runaway bride from that ambush back in the fall." Annabeth held her breath, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. She heard Luke give a short, humorless laugh. "A woman? Marshall, you see a woman here? It is just me and the wind up here. Has been for years." "So you have not seen anyone? A young woman, blonde hair, looked to be in some distress?" There was a pause. Annabeth could picture Luke leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady. She prayed he would be convincing. She knew what he was risking. Harboring a fugitive, lying to a lawman, he could lose his land, his freedom, everything. "Can't say that I have," Luke said, his voice even. "It has been a long winter. Have not seen a soul since the first snow." "All right then," Marshal Kane said, his voice full of a weary resignation. "Just had to check. The girl's intended had a brother, a man with some money and a mean streak. He is the one stirring up the talk. Says the girl's survival is a shame on his family name. Better for everyone she was just left for dead." The marshal's words were a cold slap. Not just a scandal, but a shame. Better off dead. "Sorry to have troubled you," the marshal said. She heard his footsteps move toward the door. "You take care now." "You too, Marshal." She heard the door close, and then the sound of the horse walking away, its hoofbeats fading into the silence. She stayed crouched in the dark, trembling, waiting. It felt like an eternity before she heard the rug being dragged aside and the trapdoor creaked open. Light streamed in, and Luke's face appeared in the opening. "He is gone," he said. He helped her out of the cellar. She stumbled into the light, blinking, her legs stiff and shaky. She looked at him, at his calm, steady face, and a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees washed over her. He had not hesitated. He had lied for her. He had risked everything for her. That night, the unspoken thing that had been simmering between them for weeks finally boiled over. The near miss with the marshal had stripped away all their pretenses, leaving only a raw, desperate truth. They ate their dinner in a thick, charged silence. Annabeth could not eat. She could only look at him. Finally, she put down her fork and asked the question that was consuming her. "You did not have to lie for me," she said, her voice soft but intense. "Why did you do it, Luke? Why did you risk so much for me?" He stopped eating and met her gaze across the table. The firelight danced in his gray eyes, and in their depths, she saw an emotion so profound, so raw and unguarded, that it stole her breath. He did not speak for a long time, and when he did, his voice was thick with a truth he had held inside for a lifetime. "Because you are not just some girl I found in the snow," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "You are the only woman I ever waited for." The confession, so simple and so absolute, shattered the last of her reservations. This was not obligation. This was not pity. This was something else, something deeper, a recognition of one lonely soul by another. She stood up and walked around the table to him. She stood before him, and he looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. "Tell me when," he had said. She leaned down and whispered the only word that mattered. "Now." He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He took her hand and led her to the bed. There was no desperate, fumbling kiss this time. This was a different kind of claiming. It was slow, trembling, and utterly honest. He undressed her with a reverence that made her want to weep, his calloused hands treating her as if she were made of spun glass. He mapped the faint, faded bruises on her skin not with pity, but with a tender sorrow, his lips following the path of his fingers, kissing away the last of her shame. When she stood before him, she felt not vulnerable, but seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. She, in turn, reached out and unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers tracing the hard muscles of his chest. She found the scar, a puckered, angry-looking patch of skin high on his side, the remnant of the war he never spoke of. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to it, a silent acknowledgement of his own hidden pain. They came together not in a rush of passion, but in a slow, reverent joining. It was a mapping of sorrows, an act of worship in the church of their small cabin. For Annabeth, it was a reclaiming of her own body, a discovery that a man's touch could be a source not of fear, but of healing and of a profound, soul-deep pleasure. For Luke, it was the end of a long, lonely exile, a return to a country he had thought he would never visit again. It was the quiet, reverent claiming of the woman his soul had been waiting for. They moved together in the firelight, two broken people making each other whole. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blankets, the fire burning down to embers. Annabeth was nestled in the curve of his arm, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The peace she felt was so profound, so absolute, it was almost frightening. She had found it, the thing she had been so desperate for, a place to belong. But the marshal's words echoed in her mind, a shame on his family name. The world was still out there, waiting. A new fear, sharp and keen, pierced her heart. This perfect, fragile world they had built could still be shattered. She lifted her head and looked at him in the dim light. "Are you going to let me go?" she whispered, the question full of all her newfound terror. Luke said nothing. He simply tightened his arm around her, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. He pulled her closer, burying his face in the soft, clean scent of her hair, and held on as if he were a drowning man clinging to the only piece of solid ground in the entire world. His embrace in the dark had been a promise wordlessly kept. In the weeks that followed, their cabin, once a simple refuge from the storm, became a world entire. The line between his life and her life blurred, then vanished completely. They moved around each other with the easy, unspoken grace of two people who had learned the contours of each other's souls in the quiet, firelit hours. The air was no longer charged with the sharp, painful crackle of first desire, but with a low, steady hum of deep and abiding intimacy. A home had been made, not of logs and mud, but of shared glances, quiet labor, and a love that had taken root in the most barren of soils. The coming of spring was a slow, beautiful ache. The world, for so long a study in black and white, began to bleed with color. The grim gray of the sky softened to a hopeful blue. Patches of determined green pushed their way through the last of the stubborn snow. The creek, which had been a frozen, silent thing, began to speak again, its voice a happy murmur as it swelled with meltwater. For Annabeth and Luke, the thaw was more than a change of season. It was a promise that a world beyond their valley was reawakening. And with that promise came a gnawing, unspoken anxiety. The need for supplies could no longer be ignored. Their stocks of flour, salt, and coffee had dwindled to almost nothing. One morning, Luke announced he would have to make the ride to Harmony Creek. He said it casually, as if it were of no more consequence than chopping wood. But Annabeth saw the tightness in his jaw, the grim set of his mouth. He was not just going for supplies. He was going to put his ear to the ground, to listen for the echoes of the marshal's visit. He was gone for 2 days. To Annabeth, they were the longest 2 days of her life. The cabin felt cavernous without him, the silence no longer a comfort but a hollow, aching void. Every snap of a twig outside, every cry of a distant hawk, sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept the shotgun, which he had shown her how to load and fire, propped by the door, a cold and heavy sentinel. When he finally rode out of the trees on the evening of the second day, a wave of relief so profound it made her weak in the knees washed over her. She ran outside to meet him, not caring that she was in her stocking feet. He swung down from the roan, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than the long ride. He held her for a long moment, his arms a tight, desperate band around her, his face buried in her hair. He smelled of dust and leather and the faint, sour tang of the town. He did not tell her what he had learned that night. He was more silent than usual, his thoughts a dark, turbulent river she could not cross. But she knew. She could feel the coiled tension in him, the cold anger he was trying so hard to conceal. He told her the next morning, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if the words themselves were a poison he had to expel. The rumor the marshal had spoken of was no longer a rumor. It was a shouted fact in the saloons and general stores of Harmony Creek. Elias Thorne's brother, a man named Josiah Thorne from back east, had arrived in the territory. He was a wealthy man, a man of influence, and he was consumed with what he called the Thorne family honor, the survival of his brother's mail-order bride, and the subsequent tale of her vanishing into the wilderness with a nameless drifter was not a miracle to him. It was a stain, a public humiliation. "He has put up money," Luke said, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. "Not a bounty, not officially. The law would not allow it, but it is a reward. $500 for information leading to the recovery of Annabeth Miller." Recovery. The word was sterile, clinical, as if she were a piece of lost livestock. Annabeth felt a cold dread seep into her bones. "He has made it clear what he believes," Luke continued, his voice hardening. "He believes you ran off, that you were a willing party to the ambush, perhaps that you are a woman of low character who has shamed his brother's memory." "But that is not true," she cried, the injustice of it a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. "Truth does not matter to a man like that," Luke said grimly. "Only his pride. He wants to find you, to drag you back east and hide you away where you cannot cause him any more embarrassment. He wants to erase you." The threat was no longer a nameless fear. It had a name, Josiah Thorne, and a price, $500. It would bring men looking for them, men who did not care about the truth. Luke began to spend his days reinforcing the cabin, checking the sight lines from the trees, cleaning his rifle with a meticulous, grim focus. A week passed in a state of quiet, nerves fretting tension. Annabeth found herself scanning the tree line a dozen times a day, her ears straining for the sound of an approaching horse. The confrontation came on a bright, deceptively peaceful afternoon. Luke had gone out to hunt, needing to replenish their supply of meat. He had been reluctant to leave her, but necessity had forced his hand. "Keep the gun close," he had said, his eyes dark with worry. "I will not be long." Annabeth was outside, tending to the small herb garden she had started in a patch of sun-drenched earth near the cabin door, when she heard the horse. Her head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was not Luke's roan. This was a different gait, a different sound. She straightened up, wiping her muddy hands on her apron, her eyes scanning the edge of the forest. A man on a big black horse emerged from the trees. He was dressed in town clothes, a dark coat and a bowler hat, which seemed out of place in the rugged wilderness. He sat his horse with an arrogant stillness, his eyes sweeping over the small homestead, the cabin, the corral, and her. He had a fleshy, clean-shaven face and small, shrewd eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He did not look like a bounty hunter. He looked like a clerk, or a banker. But there was a coldness in his gaze that was more menacing than any pistol. He rode closer, stopping a few yards from where she stood frozen by her garden patch. "Annabeth Miller?" he asked. His voice was smooth, educated, but it held a dismissive, condescending tone that made her skin crawl. She said nothing, her throat suddenly too tight to speak. "I am told that is your name," he continued, a thin, unpleasant smile touching his lips. "Though you seem to have found yourself in a rather rustic situation. My name is Harmon. I represent Mr. Josiah Thorne." The name was a punch to the gut. She took an involuntary step backward, toward the safety of the cabin door. Mr. Thorne is a forgiving man," Harmon said, his eyes roaming over her simple calico dress with disdain. "He understands that you have been through an ordeal. He is prepared to make you a generous offer. Come back with me now, quietly, and he will see to it that you are provided for. He will send you back east, to a quiet place where you can live out your days without causing any further disruption." Disruption? He made her sound like a piece of faulty machinery. The blood began to pound in her ears. "I am not going anywhere," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into her words. "I am not going anywhere." Harmon's smile tightened. "I am afraid you misunderstand. This is not a request. You are a scandal, Miss Miller. A loose end. Mr. Thorne intends to see you tied up. He has authorized me to use whatever means are necessary to recover his brother's intended." He swung a leg over his saddle, dismounting with a heavy, deliberate motion. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. The face of Silas, the bandit with the coyote eyes, flashed in her mind. She turned and fled into the cabin, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and throwing the bar across it. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grasp the thick piece of wood. "There is no point in hiding. Miss Miller!" Harmon's voice was a muffled shout from outside. "This is a crude little shack. I can have this door down in minutes." She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the small room. The shotgun. It was leaning against the wall by the hearth, just as Luke had left it. She ran to it, her movements clumsy with terror. It was heavy, heavier than she had imagined, and the stock was cold and slick in her sweaty palms. She checked the load, her fingers fumbling with the mechanism in the way Luke had shown her. She raised the gun, the long barrel seeming to have a life of its own, wavering unsteadily. A heavy thud shook the door. He was throwing his shoulder against it. Another thud, and the wood groaned in protest. Annabeth swallowed the terror that was rising in her throat. This was her home. The man on the other side of that door wanted to drag her away from it, to erase her, to destroy the only happiness she had ever known. He wanted to take her from Luke. A new emotion, hot and fierce, surged through her, burning away the cold edges of her fear. It was rage. She walked to the door, the shotgun held tight against her shoulder. "You stay away from this house!" she shouted, her voice shaking but loud. "You take one more step, and I will shoot!" There was a moment of silence from outside, and then a condescending chuckle. "You, a little slip of a thing like you do not have the nerve." Another crash against the door, and this time, a crack appeared in the thick planks. That was it. Her resolve hardened into a cold, sharp point. She raised the barrel of the shotgun so it was level, pointed directly at the splintering wood of the door. "Try me," she whispered to herself. And then, a new voice cut through the air, low and cold as a river stone. "I would not do that if I were you." Annabeth's head whipped around toward the window. "Luke," he was standing at the edge of the clearing. his hunting rifle held loosely in one hand, but his posture was anything but relaxed. He was a figure of absolute, lethal stillness. He must have circled around, silent as a ghost. Outside, Harmon froze. He slowly turned to face the newcomer. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice losing some of its confident bluster. "I am the man who lives here," Luke said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. His eyes were flat, gray, and as cold as a winter sky. "And you are trespassing. I want you on your horse and off my land. Now." "This does not concern you," Harmon blustered, trying to regain his authority. "I am here on business for Mr. Josiah Thorne." "Your business is finished," Luke said, his voice dropping even lower. "You threatened the woman in that cabin. You tried to break down my door. That makes it my concern." He took another step, and the rifle in his hand no longer looked casual. "You have 10 seconds to get on your horse before I forget you are a town man." Harmon looked from Luke's cold, hard face to the rifle, and whatever courage he had evaporated. He was a bully and a talker, not a fighter. He scrambled back onto his horse with a clumsy haste, his face pale and sweating. He gathered his reins, shot one last, hateful look at the cabin door, and then spurred his horse, galloping away into the trees. Luke stood motionless until the sound of the horse had completely faded. Only then did he move, his body seeming to sag slightly as the tension drained from him. He walked to the cabin and lifted the bar. The door swung open, and he saw her, standing in the middle of the room, the big shotgun still clutched in her hands, her face pale, her knuckles white. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gently took the gun from her. Her hands fell to her sides, empty, and she began to shake uncontrollably. He set the gun aside and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. She buried her face in his chest, her body racked with a storm of delayed terror and relief. "It is all right," he murmured into her hair. "You are safe. I am here." But later that evening, after the adrenaline had faded, his relief was replaced by a cold, simmering fury. He paced the small cabin like a caged wolf. He was not angry at her. He was furious with himself for leaving her alone, furious with Harmon, with Josiah Thorne, with the whole rotten world that had put her in that position. "This is not the end of it," he said, his voice a low growl. "They will be back. They will send more men. We cannot live like this, looking over our shoulder every minute of every day." He stopped his pacing and stood before her, his face a grim mask. "You have to go to town. Annabeth. You have to go to Marshal Kane and tell him everything. You have to clear your name, use the law. It is the only way this will ever end." Annabeth looked at him, her heart sinking. After everything they had been through, after everything they had become to each other, he wanted to send her away. He wanted to send her back into that world that had already judged and condemned her. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not." "You have to," he insisted, his frustration making his voice sharp. "It is the only way to be safe." "Safe?" she asked, a bitter laugh escaping her. "There is no safety for me out there. Did you not hear the marshal? Did you not hear that man today? To them, I am a shame, a disruption, a loose end to be tied up. The law will not protect me. Luke, it will only give them another way to hurt me." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and a deep, wounded hurt. "I will not go back to that. I will not leave this cabin." She looked around at the small, familiar room, at the life they had built together. "I will not leave the only place I have ever been loved." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He stared at her, the anger and frustration draining from his face, replaced by a look of raw, naked pain. He sank onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. "Luke," she whispered, going to him, kneeling before him. He looked up at her, and she saw in his eyes the true source of his fear. It was not for her physical safety alone. It was something deeper, something that came from the broken places inside him. "Do you think I want to send you away?" he asked, his voice rough with anguish. "Annabeth, the thought of this cabin being empty again, it is a kind of death." He took a shaky breath. "But when I see you, when I see the strength in you, the goodness, I know you deserve more than this, more than a rough cabin and a broken man with nothing to his name." His voice dropped, full of a self-loathing that broke her heart. "I am afraid, Annabeth, I am afraid that if you go out there, into the world, you will see what you are missing. You will find someone better, someone whole, a man who can give you a proper home, a proper life, a name, and you will leave me, and you will be right to do it." The confession hung in the air between them, a testament to the depth of his old wounds. He thought he was not enough for her, that their love, forged in the fire of a brutal winter, was not enough to hold her. Annabeth felt a surge of love for this man so fierce it was a physical pain in her chest. She reached up and cupped his rough, unshaven face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me, Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. "There is no better. There is no one more whole than a man who can find a half-dead girl in the snow and bring her back to life. There is no finer home than the one we have made right here, and there is no name I would rather have than the one you have given me in your heart." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "There is no better than the man who carried me home." He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the grime on his cheek. She had seen through all his defenses, all his fears, and had answered them with a simple, absolute truth. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the floor of their cabin, two solitary souls clinging to one another. When he finally looked at her again, the fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a new, quiet determination. "All right," he said. "Then we do this together." "Together?" she asked. "We will not run, and we will not hide," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We will ride into Harmony Creek, together, and we will face them, not as a drifter and a runaway, but as husband and wife." Annabeth's heart soared. "Even without a preacher?" "A preacher says words over you," he said, his hand coming up to cover hers on his cheek. "He does not make the truth. We have already made the truth right here." A new plan was forged in the embers of their fear. They would not wait for Josiah Thorne to come to them. They would go to him. They would go to the world. The next days were filled with a new, purposeful energy. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing for a new life. The first thing Luke did was teach her to ride properly. He put her on the roan, his hands firm and steady on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. At first, the old fear from the ambush returned, the memory of being helpless on a runaway wagon. But Luke's calm, patient voice was a constant reassurance. He walked beside her, his hand on the bridle, talking her through every step, until her fear gave way to a tentative confidence, and then, finally, to a thrilling sense of freedom. While she practiced riding, he worked on the old buckboard wagon that had been sitting, neglected, behind the cabin. He replaced a broken wheel, mended the harness, and greased the axles. They worked together, a team, their movements in easy harmony. And Annabeth began to sew. She did not have fine silk or lace, but she did have the remnants of her old life, the tattered white cotton of the chemise and petticoats she had been wearing when he found her. For weeks, she had been painstakingly washing, bleaching, and mending the delicate fabric, salvaging every usable scrap. Now, with a quiet, fierce determination, she began to stitch them together. She was not sewing the dress of a naive mail-order bride. She was creating a new garment, a dress born of fire and ashes. It was a simple dress, with long sleeves and a high collar, but every stitch was a testament to her survival, every patch a memory of her resilience. It would be a wedding dress made not of pristine hope, but of a hard-won, undeniable love. As she sewed, She felt she was not just mending fabric. She was mending the torn edges of her own soul, creating a new future for herself, for them. One careful, hopeful stitch at a time. The journey to Harmony Creek was a journey from one world to another. The wilderness they left behind was a place of stark, simple truths. Hunger, cold, survival, and the quiet, fierce truth of the love they had found there. The town, when it rose from the prairie ahead of them, was a place of complicated, man-made truths, laws, rumors, judgments, and fear. The air, which for months had smelled only of pine and snow and wood smoke, now thickened with the scents of coal, manure, and frying bacon. The silence was replaced by the rumble of wagon wheels, the sharp ring of a blacksmith's hammer, and the low murmur of human voices. They rode in on the buckboard wagon, Luke sitting tall and straight, his hands steady on the reins, his familiar rifle resting by his side. Beside him, Annabeth held her head high, her back as straight as a poker. She wore the dress she had made, its patchwork of white cotton a stark and simple statement in the dusty brown street. It was not the dress of a bride going to her wedding, but of a woman going to war for her own life. As they moved down the main street, the town seemed to hold its breath. Conversations on the boardwalks faltered and died. A woman sweeping her porch stopped, her broom held motionless in midair. Men leaning against the front of the saloon turned as one, their eyes following the wagon's slow progress. Annabeth felt their stares like a physical touch, 100 pinpricks of curiosity, suspicion, and condemnation. She could hear the whispers begin to buzz behind them, like flies stirring in the afternoon heat. She felt Luke's hand, calloused and warm, cover hers where it rested on the hard wooden bench. It was a small, grounding gesture, a silent reminder that they faced this together. She did not flinch. She met the stares of the townspeople with a calm, steady gaze, her chin held high. The girl who had been dragged from a wagon in this very pass months ago was gone. In her place was a woman who would not be dragged anywhere ever again. Their destination was a plain, false-fronted building with faded letters that read, Marshall. Luke pulled the wagon to a stop and tethered the horse. He came around and helped her down, his hands firm on her waist. They walked up the 3 wooden steps and pushed open the door. Marshall Kane sat behind a scarred wooden desk, a stack of papers before him and a half-empty coffee cup at his elbow. The office was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke and dust. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from mild surprise to a weary recognition. He looked from Luke's grim, determined face to Annabeth's pale but resolute one. "I had a feeling I might be seeing you two sooner or later," he said, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Marshall," Luke said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "This is Annabeth Miller. She has come to tell you her story." Annabeth stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her to still their trembling. She stood before the desk, a small, slender figure in a homemade white dress, and she began to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, but it gained strength as she went on. She told him everything, her words simple, direct, and unadorned with self-pity. She spoke of her journey west as a mail-order bride, of her hopes for a new life. She described the ambush in the pass, the brutal, senseless violence, the death of Elias Thorne and the others. She spoke of being dragged away, of the bandits' argument, of being left for dead in the encroaching winter. Then she spoke of Luke. She told of waking in a strange cabin, of his distant kindness, of the long, snowbound months of her slow recovery. She did not spare herself or the truth. "He saved my life. Marshall," she said, her eyes clear and unwavering. "He gave me shelter and protection when I had nothing and no one. When the world thought I was dead, he was the only one who saw that I was still alive." Marshall Kane listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He was a man accustomed to lies and half-truths, and he knew the ring of the genuine article when he heard it. "And when the snows cleared," he prompted gently, "he offered to bring you here." "Yes," Annabeth said. He did. He told me I should come here, get a room, find work. So why did you not? The marshal asked. His eyes shrewd. This was the moment, the turning point, the confession that would either save her or condemn her in the eyes of the law and the world. Because I chose not to, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. I chose to stay with him. The life I came for was taken from me in that pass. The life I have now is the one I have chosen. I belong with him. She glanced at Luke, who stood by the door, his face a mask of stone, but she saw the fierce pride burning in his eyes. The marshal was silent for a long time, his fingers drumming a slow, thoughtful rhythm on the worn surface of his desk. He looked from Annabeth to Luke and back again. He saw not a criminal and his victim, but two solitary people who had found something real in the midst of a tragedy. Finally, he let out a long sigh. As far as the law is concerned, he said, his voice heavy, your testimony clears this man of any wrongdoing. He did not abduct you. He rendered aid to a person in distress. He did what any decent man ought to have done. He leveled a hard gaze at Luke. He is a free man. A wave of relief washed over Annabeth, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But, the marshal continued, his voice a low warning, you need to understand something, both of you. He leaned forward, his expression grave. That is where the law's protection ends. I can clear a man of a crime, but I cannot make people accept a situation they are determined to misunderstand. Josiah Thorne is a man with a long reach and a loud voice. He has painted a picture of you. Miss, that will be hard to wash away. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. The law will not protect what society will not accept. You will have a hard road ahead of you. Be ready for it. They left the marshal's office and stepped back out into the harsh afternoon sun. The air felt lighter. A legal burden had been lifted, but the social one remained, a heavy, invisible weight. As they stood on the boardwalk, a man in a dusty black coat approached them. He was older, with a kind, weary face and gentle eyes. Pardon me, he said, his voice soft. My name is Reverend Miller. I am just passing through your town. I could not help but overhear some of the talk, and then I saw you two walk into the marshal's office. He gave them a small, compassionate smile. It seems to me that you are two people who have made a sacred vow in your hearts, even if no one has said the words over you. Sometimes, those are the truest vows of all. He looked from Luke to Annabeth. I am not an official minister of any church in this territory, so I cannot give you a piece of paper that the law would recognize. But if you would like, I would be honored to say a prayer and bear witness to your commitment before God. It is the best I can offer. Annabeth looked at Luke, her heart swelling. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. He saw the look in her eyes and nodded slowly. We would be honored, Reverend, he said. The Reverend led them away from the prying eyes of the main street, down a small path to the banks of the creek that gave the town its name. The water murmured over smooth stones, and the afternoon sun dappled through the leaves of the cottonwood trees. It was a place of peace. They stood by the riverbank, just the three of them, and held hands. There were no flowers, no guests, no fancy words. The Reverend spoke a simple prayer, his voice a gentle counterpoint to the sound of the running water. Then he asked them to speak their vows. Luke turned to her, his calloused hands holding hers. His gray eyes, so often guarded and distant, were open and full of a love so profound it made her breath catch. Annabeth, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have been alone for a very long time. I thought that was all my life would be. And then I found you. You were the best thing I ever found. I will protect you. I will honor you. I will stand by you for all the days of my life. You are my home. Tears streamed freely down Annabeth's cheeks as she spoke her own vows, her voice trembling, but true. Luke, you carried me from the darkness into the light. You taught me that my life was worth fighting for. You made me feel safe when I thought I would never feel safe again. You are the only man I have ever loved, and you are the only man I will ever love. My heart is yours. My life is yours. Wherever you go, that is my home." They stood there in the dappled sunlight, husband and wife in the eyes of God and in their own hearts. It was a truth that no rumor or judgment could ever take away. But as they walked back toward the main street, their quiet joy was shattered. A man stood waiting for them in the middle of the road, blocking their path. He was impeccably dressed in a fine Eastern suit, but his face was pale and contorted with a bitter, righteous fury. It was Josiah Thorne. He was flanked by two rough-looking men, hired muscle by the looks of them. "So, the whore and her keeper decide to show their faces in public," Josiah sneered, his voice dripping with venom. His eyes, small and cold, raked over Annabeth with a look of pure loathing. "You have dragged my family's good name through the mud. My brother, a good, respectable man, is dead, and you, his intended, are alive and shacking up with this nobody." Luke stepped in front of Annabeth, his body a solid shield. His hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. "That is enough," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You will not speak to my wife that way." "Your wife?" Josiah spat out the word as if it were poison. "You have no wife. You have a ruined woman who should have had the decency to die in the wilderness. I have come to collect what is mine by right, to take her back and put her where she can do no more harm." His men took a step forward, their hands moving toward their own guns. The air crackled with tension. Townsfolk, sensing a confrontation, began to gather at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Luke did not move. He stood his ground, a lone wolf ready to defend his mate to the death. But before he could draw his weapon, Annabeth put a hand on his arm and stepped out from behind him. She faced Josiah Thorne, her small frame straight and unbowed. She looked not at his hired guns, but directly into his cold, hate-filled eyes. The fear was gone, burned away by a righteous anger and a love that was stronger than any man's pride. "I am not yours to punish," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out in the sudden silence of the street. "Your brother is dead because of wicked men, not because of me. The shame you feel is your own. I survived, and I chose to live. I chose a life with this good and honorable man. You have no claim on me. You have no power over me. My life is my own." Her words, so simple and so powerful, struck Josiah Thorne like a physical blow. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He had come for a cowering, shamed woman he could bully and break. He had found a queen defending her kingdom. He saw the looks on the faces of the townspeople, the grudging respect beginning to dawn in their eyes as they looked at this woman who refused to be a victim. His righteous crusade had turned into a public humiliation, with a choked sound of pure, impotent rage. He turned on his heel. "This is not over," he snarled, but the threat was empty. He and his men mounted their horses and rode out of town, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and a defeated, bitter silence. The town did not change overnight. There were still whispers, still sideways glances, but something had shifted. They had seen Annabeth's strength, had heard the truth in her voice. They had seen Luke's quiet, unwavering devotion. Acceptance, when it came, was slow and grudging, earned one day at a time. It began with a nod from a shopkeeper, then a hesitant good morning from a woman on the street. It came in the form of trade. Annabeth skillfully baked bread for a sack of potatoes. Luke's hunted game for a new axe head. They did not ask for acceptance. They simply lived their lives with a quiet dignity that, in the end, was more powerful than any rumor. Months passed. They sold Luke's small, isolated cabin and used the money, along with what Luke had saved, to buy a piece of land higher up the valley, a place with a wide, clear view of the mountains. They worked together, side by side, to build a new, larger cabin, one with 2 rooms and a proper porch. Annabeth planted a garden, her hands in the rich, dark earth, and coaxed life from it, rows of beans, corn, and bright, cheerful sunflowers. They were not just surviving anymore. They were building. They were putting down roots. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Luke rode in leading a small, spindle-legged colt. Its mother had been taken by a mountain lion, he explained, and he could not just leave it. Annabeth's heart melted at the sight of the orphaned creature. It was another life saved from the wilderness, another soul to nurture. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of their new, unfinished home, a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming settled over Annabeth. Luke came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against his solid chest, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep purple of the sky. Without a word, he scooped her up into his arms. She gave a small cry of surprise, followed by a laugh, as he carried her toward the open doorway of their new home. He paused on the threshold, his face lit by the warm glow of the lantern inside, his eyes full of a deep and endless love. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne," he said, using a name that was not his, but was now theirs. He carried her over the threshold and into the home they had built together. As he set her down, she clung to him, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The journey had been long and terrible, but it had led her here. It had led her home. She tightened her arms around his neck, holding on to this perfect, precious moment. She whispered the words that had once been a plea of terror, but were now a prayer of love. "Please do not let go yet." He held her tighter, his voice a low, rough promise in the quiet of their home, a vow that would last for all their days to come. Never again. Thank you for being a part of this journey through the heart of the Old West. I encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow story lovers. And please subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts and join our community.